Alright guys, today we're going to talk about 4 gentlemen by the names of Fred, Ted, Jim, and Tim. And these guys have a lot more in common than just their names rhyming. If you've been around the hunting community for any amount of time, I'm sure you heard of the names Fred Bear, Ted Nugent, Tim Wells, and Jim Shockey. But for those of you new to the hunting scene, or maybe you just never really known why these guys get talked about, then stick around to see not only how these guys changed the sport of bow hunting, but conservation as well. And like always, be sure to like, subscribe, and let's get into it. To start, we are taking a step back in time all the way to 1902, where in a little town within the Keystone State, the father of bow hunting was born. It's crazy to try to imagine the way things were back then, because at this point in time, my home state here in Oklahoma wasn't even a state until 1907. So on that same note, keep in mind that archery back then wasn't as popular as it is today. And so Fred Bear grew up a gun hunter and actually didn't even pick up a bow until he was 29 years old after seeing Art Young's film, Adventures in Alaska. After watching that film, Fred said he was ready to be done gun hunting completely just because he said there wasn't enough challenge in it.
Biggest deer I ever saw. And it was so easy. Opening morning, I walked up my draw. There he was looking at me, and I looked at him, and I shot him, and he went down, and that's when the work began.
And so that kind of makes me wonder how he would feel about crossbows being classified as archery equipment. At this point in Fred's life, he was working as a plant manager for Chrysler. And listen, I know we've all had those days where we go into work and we would like nothing more than for wherever we're working at to just burn to the ground. Well, that actually happened to Fred, and the building he worked in burned completely to the ground, which left him unemployed.
What's the procedure, everyone? What's the procedure?
So Fred then teamed up with the guy named Charles Piper, who was one of his old co-workers from the burnt down Chrysler building situation, and they decided to start their own print advertising business in Detroit. Well, when he wasn't doing that, you could always find him tinkering with or creating some sort of new piece of equipment that could either help him in his archery competitions or in the actual hunt. Around the same time period, Fred Bear was starting to make a name for himself around the archery world by winning Michigan's Target Archery Championship in 1934, 1937, and 1939. And also in 1937, he played a vital role in helping Michigan create their first ever bow hunting season, which soon led to many other states doing the same. As Fred's fame grew, so did his business. And so he had to hire a man by the name of Nels Grumley, who was an expert bow maker, to help out. You see, Fred's archery business kept demanding more and more of his time and focus, and so in 1940, they decided to split Bear Products, where Charles Piper kept the print advertising side of the business, and Fred kept his archery business, which is now what we call Bear Archery. Fred continued to perfect his craft and quickly became a pioneer in the archery world for creating patents for tools that are used by bow hunters all around the world. These are things like the shooting glove, razor head broadheads, fiberglass bow backings, and even the bow quiver that attaches to the bow and not on your back or the hip. And you can't forget one of his most impressive inventions, the takedown traditional bow, which took Bear more than 20 years to perfect. But like every business, you have your ups and downs, and every now and then there are some sacrifices that need to be made. In 1947, Fred moved his shop to Grayling, Michigan to try to help keep up with production, and so to keep his personal expenses down, he and his wife actually lived in a wall tent on the side of a river. But thankfully, as more states allowed bow hunting, his profits increased, which helped Fred out when he seen an opportunity to create a market for his products.
And at that time, I had to not only make a product, but I had to create a market for it. So I got in the promotional business, and I soon found that the newspapers weren't interested in scores of a tournament, but if you could run down there with a deer or a bear you shot with a bow, you might make front page.
With this in mind, Fred went on hunting trips all around the world. He would go on to chase animals like elk, moose, lions, tigers, and bears.
Lions and tigers and bears. Oh my.
And during all these hunts, he managed to not only take 1, but 6 record-breaking big game animals. And as a bonus tidbit, he was actually the first Michigan bow hunter to ever take a whitetail on film. It wasn't until 1968 when Fred actually sold his company to give it a better opportunity to expand, but he stayed on as one of the chairmen for the company. And a few years later, in 1972, Fred Bear was inducted into the Bow Hunters Hall of Fame. Even through his older years, he still continued to hunt and shoot archery competitions all the way up until his death in 1988. Now, I know there are a lot of Fred's accomplishments that I didn't touch on, but it's just crazy to think how a small bow shop that started in the Great Depression managed to succeed and become one of the leading archery companies still to this day. And with the impact he and his company brought upon the archery world, it's hard to think just where bow hunting or even just archery in general would be without Mr. Fred Bear. So I guess that just deserves a little bit of respect behind his name. The next person we're going to talk about was actually very good friends with Fred Bear, and he even ended up writing a song about him that I assume has blown out many radio speakers across the nation when it comes to opening day and driving to the deer stand. And if you haven't figured it out already, ladies and gentlemen, I give you the Motor City Madman, the Nuge, Mr. Uncle Ted himself, Ted Nugent. Born in Redford, Michigan in 1948, Ted grew up in a military household, so I assume he was around weapons at a fairly early age, but I bet you Ted's dad could have never guessed that Ted's most effective weapon would have been the 6-string and the 1-string. As a kid, Ted was crazy about hunting. He would always be outside trying to fling an arrow at something, and every year his dad would take him on an annual hunting trip. On the way to the woods, they would always stop at this little old bow shop called Bear Archery, and inside there was a tall, lanky man by the name of Fred Bear. At first, Ted didn't really know who Fred was until after a few more visits and finally putting the pieces together after seeing Fred's face on a cover of a few magazines. And Ted and his dad continued to visit with Fred at his shop up until Ted was about 16 years old when they had to move to Chicago because his dad got relocated for some job or something. Well, in 1967, Ted ended up finishing high school, and around this same time, he started a band called the Amboy Dukes. And that band had a little notoriety, but his fame really skyrocketed when he pursued his solo career in the 70s. And even though at the time Ted was busy being a rock and roll legend, he never lost his love for bow hunting. In fact, there were times when Ted actually shot a bow and arrow while he was performing on stage.
I shot my bow and arrow on stage forever. I'd shoot flaming arrows at skulls and a big illegal, I think it was a felony, a big turkey vulture I had stuffed, but it looked great backlit, you know, and I'd shoot that off the amps at night and people didn't know whether to shit or go blind.
But little did Ted realize he was actually promoting archery by doing so. To millions of music lovers, Ted has definitely carved his name forever in rock and roll history by selling out concerts in record-breaking time and selling over 40 million albums. Of those being albums like Ted Nugent, Cat Scratch Fever, and Free For All. But of all the songs and all of his albums, the most famous in the eye of any hunter would probably have to be the song Fred Bear, which he did not release until 1995 on his album Spirit of the Wild. And if you never heard this song before, just go to any local gas station around 4 a.m. on the opening day of deer season, and sooner or later there'll be a truck pulling in, probably to stock up on coffee and Little Debbie's. But if you pay close attention, you'll probably be able to hear this exact song coming out of those blown speakers that's rattling the truck apart. It is the opening day national anthem when heading out to the woods.
There I was, back in the wild again. And I'm telling you, even as I'm talking about it right now, look at the goosebumps.
Since then, Ted has probably become one of our most outspoken proponents for our First and Second Amendment rights. And after a quick YouTube search, you can find countless interviews with him, and he isn't shy to say that he is a God-fearing, gun-loving, guitar-playing dude. Now, there are a few things I haven't mentioned yet, like having an award-winning TV show, being a New York Times best-selling author, and being inducted into the Bowhunters Hall of Fame. But even with all his accomplishments, he is still doing his best to conserve the hunting heritage and to help out the hunting community whenever possible. He has created a nonprofit called Camp for Kids, where he teaches people about nature and what benefits it can provide. And on top of that, he puts on hunts for sick and terminally ill kids with Hunt of a Lifetime and Hunt for a Cure. So with everything he's done and how he's used his fame to help bring popularity to the sport of bow hunting, I'd say it'd be enough to make that tall, lanky man named Fred Bear proud. The next hunting legend on our list, we have the Slop Master. Tim Wells was born in Canton, Illinois in 1963 and was raised as just your typical good old farm boy and grew up around hunting all of his childhood. Tim started whitetail hunting at the age of 5 and ended up getting a button buck on the ground when he was just 9 years old, with a recurve, I might add. At first, Tim thought he wanted to be an outdoor rider. He wrote for magazines like North American Whitetail, Buckmasters, and Bowhunter magazine, and was doing pretty well with it, but he didn't really feel like that's where he belonged within the hunting world. Well, one day when Tim was at a whitetail expo, he noticed that there was actually a market for filming your hunts.
There was a guy in the corner, his name was Noel Feather. He was a great whitetail hunter, and he made a video, and I'll never forget watching, there was 25 people in line handing him $20 bills as fast as they could, and I'm like, that's what I'm gonna do.
So not long after, he bought a VHS camera and spent the next year hunting as much as he could and trying to film all of it. And he used all that footage he gathered from that past year to release his very first film, Lethal Flight. And it absolutely swept through the hunting space by selling more than 543,000 copies. But what really skyrocketed Tim's fame was what's known as the shot heard around the world. And no, I'm not referring to the Revolutionary War. On the very first season of his new show, The Relentless Pursuit, Tim sneaks up on a massive grizzly bear and ends up putting an arrow right between the eyes. And long story short, everybody and their dog wanted to see that hunt, which in return opened up a lot of doors for Tim. Now, on a little side note, the best thing I like about Tim is he gives credit where credit is due. And what I mean by that is he will straight up say that he gives God all the credit for him being able to harvest that one grizzly, leading up to all of his success to this day. And I just love it, and I applaud him for that.
Too many things in life have happened to my family and to myself that, to take it for granted that something greater hasn't been involved. And I believe that God has opened a lot of doors for us throughout our lifetime.
Anyways, Tim has made a name for himself by doing things that not a lot of hunters would be willing to do. You see, Tim has bow hunted all of his life, but has never once put a sight on his bow. Now me, I sometimes struggle with getting a deer down with a modern day compound bow, and I use a peep, a sight, and a release. But Tim does everything primitive. Whether that be with a trad bow, a spear, or a blowgun, Tim goes on some insane hunts all around the world and still manages to get an animal down in the process. From harvesting a giant bear with a blow dart, to spearing a Cape buffalo, to even shooting birds out of the air with his bow. I don't know how much more action you could fit into his videos. And there was even a video of Tim running into the most elusive creature in the world, Bigfoot.
Give me the camera.
And from the looks of it, it seems Tim has poked about every animal on the planet, including himself. While spear hunting in Africa, Tim climbed up a tree and started getting everything set up for his hunt. But while getting all of his camera gear situated, he accidentally dropped a GoPro, which fell to the ground and ended up right next to his bait pile. Well, since he had some previous experience with hunting Africa, he knew that the animals there were super skittish, and if they were to see that GoPro laying on the ground, they would most likely get startled and booger off before he was able to stick them with the spear. So Tim started climbing down to retrieve his GoPro. Well, with his attention focused on other things, he forgot that his spear was barely wedged up in the tree above him.
And I got about 2/3 of the way down the tree, and my foot slipped on one of the branches. When it did, I fell, and I kind of, I had my hands and I shook the tree. And when I did, I didn't know, but death was coming down to me.
So with him halfway down a tree in the middle of Africa with the 7-foot spear sticking out of his leg, he knew he couldn't move to go get help without getting the spear out of his leg first. So after assessing the situation, he was worried that if he pushed the spear all the way through, then it would cut his femoral artery in half. So he elected to just rip the band-aid off and to pull the spear out the way it entered, and by doing so, hoping it wouldn't also cut his artery. But long story short, it did. What makes the situation even worse is Tim is hunting by himself, and the radio he has to call for help is at the top of his tree where he was before he dropped his GoPro. So with his artery cut, he knew he couldn't make it to the top of the tree without basically bleeding out. So he had to just sit there past dark until some people came looking for him. And because the big guy upstairs was looking out for him, he managed to make a full recovery and is still doing these insane hunts to this day. Last but not least, we are traveling north to Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, to the birthplace of a guy whose closet is probably nothing but black hats and red bandanas. Born Born 1957, Jim Shockey spent the first 6 years of his life traveling around living in trailers because his dad was on a road construction crew. Jim's hunting journey, I feel, started out the same as a lot of ours, where at first, you chased rabbits and squirrels and then slowly progressed into bigger game like whitetail. And the first whitetail he shot being around the age of 14. Jim grew up hunting with his dad, and he basically taught him everything he knew. But they both kind of viewed it a little differently. You see, his father is what we call a meat hunter, and if his dad could be tagged out on the very first day of season, then that would basically be a perfect season for him. And if you're new to hunting, all a meat hunter is just a person who solely hunts just for the meat. Now, obviously, they're out there for their enjoyment, the experience, and want to harvest a big antlered deer. But if a big-bodied basket rat comes strutting through, they're not going to give it the pass. But as for Jim, he wanted to stretch his season out as long as possible and then end it on the biggest antlered deer he could find. And today, that is what we call a trophy hunter. When Jim was in his 20s, he owned a couple of antique stores, but eventually sold them off to help pay for an outfitting business on Vancouver Island. When he wasn't guiding black bear hunts, Jim often found himself writing for a few outdoor Canadian magazines, but eventually started writing for magazines within the United States to try to promote his outfitting business by telling about the black bear hunts. Fast forward to 1995, he decided to buy another outfitting business, but this time it was in Saskatchewan and it was for whitetail, which was right around the time trophy whitetail hunting was becoming popular, so you could imagine business was pretty darn good. And it was also around this time that Jim happened to stumble upon his iconic look with the black cowboy hat and red bandana. I mean, you would think there'd be some epic tale about how a mighty storm came rolling in during one of Jim's hunts, and a strong wind blew a fiery bandana upon his neck just before a deafening clash of thunder sounded, as a lightning bolt came from the heavens and placed a hat upon his head that was the color of midnight. But that wasn't the case. It was as simple as he once borrowed a black cowboy hat from one of his guides for a picture, and he turned out to like the look. And then one day, a guy named Richard told him he needed a flash of color to help him stand out more, and so he went and bought a red bandana. Thus, his iconic look was born. In the later parts of the 1990s, hunting shows were becoming more popular, and Jim thought it would be a good idea to show people what it was like hunting in different countries. But the only problem with that is, at that time, and heck, even still to this day, deer and turkey seem to be America's favorite animals to hunt and to watch. So there was a lot of people that was skeptical and thought the show wouldn't really do well just because it couldn't really relate to its current audience. Well, long story short, they were wrong. With his shows, Jim Shockey's The Professionals, Uncharted, and Hunting Adventures, he has ranked in the top 5 most watched hunting shows in the last 10 years. And on top of that, he's won countless awards across many networks, such as the Outdoor Channel's Golden Moose Awards and the Sportsman's Channel's Sportsman's Choice Awards. All while doing that, he has published 3 books and has written over 1,000 articles for the largest outdoor magazines. But besides all his success from his film producing side of it, that doesn't hold a match to what he's actually done in the field. It is said that Jim Shockey is probably the most accomplished big game hunter that is still alive today. This man has taken 367 free-ranged big game species. And just to put it into perspective, you could harvest a new big game species every single day for an entire year, and on the very last day of the year, you would still be too short of Jim Shockey's total. And to accomplish all this, he's had to travel throughout 6 different continents to over 50 different countries. He's got 88 world records for SCI, and in total has over 400 record book entries, and 13 of those being in the Boone and Crockett all-time record book. And as you probably guessed, with all the different species he's hunted around the world, he has completed the North American Super Slam, but the kicker is he's the first person to ever do it with a muzzleloader. Now again, with everything he's harvested, there have been a few rare animals that he's taken throughout the years. But instead of this hurting an already struggling population, it actually benefits them in a great way. You see, most people are okay with taking a deer for meat, but seem to not be able to grasp someone taking an elephant, a big cat, or maybe some rare species of mountain goat. Well, Jim has a very strong hunting is conservation message, and it makes total sense. As he stated in an Outdoor Life article, he basically says that conservation boils down to supply and demand economics. As sad as it sounds, if big game animals have a monetary value, then they will be conserved, and if they don't, then they will probably go extinct. And the reason for that is, typically where these endangered species are located, the people that live there just don't have the resources to manage them properly. In that same Outdoor Life article, Jim gives a good example of these wild goats that live in Pakistan. I don't know how to pronounce their names, so I'm not even going to try. But basically, these goats were hunted by local tribes and shot by poachers almost to extinction, where there were only about 200 remaining. Well, then a hunting program was passed that allowed a few wealthy hunters to pay a small amount of $250,000 to harvest only the mature male goats. And in return, that money was used to hire 80 armed guards to help stop poaching, and now there are more than 3,000 of those goats in the wild. But you see, this example right here is what makes Jim Shockey so great. This man took a risk to not only show everybody that there is a big world to explore, but also just how much of a positive impact hunting really has on the conservation of animals. And for him, it seems like it isn't just about him taking that trophy animal to feel some sort of ego. Jim's shown what it actually means to pursue an animal and the experiences and the appreciation that goes into not only the things he's hunted, but the places he's been and the people that live there. And it seems like he's preached that message on every single hunt he's been on. Now, I know there are a lot more accomplishments that these guys have that I didn't point out, but to wrap this bad boy up, I feel the biggest takeaway that makes this group of hunters so special is what hunting means to them. Yes, they accomplish things out in the woods that an average guy couldn't accomplish in 3 lifetimes, but even all that aside, each of these guys felt a strong connection to the pursuit of the animal and took greater appreciation of what the hunt actually consisted of, rather than just the trigger pull itself. You know, Fred Bear talks about how the outdoors will cleanse your soul, while Ted talks about the mystical flight of the arrow. Basically, what I'm trying to say is each one of these guys have a greater passion for hunting rather than just being a trigger man, and it shows. So as hunters, I feel like we all need to kind of take a step back and sometimes reevaluate ourselves on why we hunt and try to get away from that modern day hunter that seems to be ego-filled. Now, I know there are a lot more legendary hunters out there, so be sure to drop down in the comments who you want to see next. And with that, be sure to like, subscribe, and always know that Jesus loves you.